In this episode of the Afghan Eye podcast, Ahmed-Waleed and I are going to review the book of John J. Mearsheimer on American liberal hegemony and how this applied to Afghanistan. Welcome to the Afghan Eye YouTube channel. If this is your first visit, make sure to subscribe and press the notification bell so that you won't miss any of our new videos. Assalamu alaikum, I'm your host Sangar Paikar.
And I'm Ahmed-Waleed Kakar.
Welcome to another episode of Afghan Eye. Ahmed-Waleed Kakar, how have you been lately? How are you doing? You're looking fresh. Have you changed something about your appearance?
I actually did. I don't know if you could note it. Well, first of all, alhamdulillah, I'm doing fantastic. Secondly, I lowered my beard lining. As most guys can probably relate, I was fixing my beard, made a mistake, and the only way to salvage it was bringing down the beard line. Since then, comments have been mixed, some positive, some negative. I'm sure the comment section will have their say.
Are you becoming more liberal because we are talking about a book that discusses liberalism?
No, I'm not. To be honest, though, Islamically, I don't think, according to most jurists, the beard is defined as what the hair on the face. It's more so this. So, in case anyone is like, I'm still very much on the Islamically correct path. I notice as well, after a lot of positive feedback on your hat in the last live stream, you're now wearing another hat. I like this one. It's where did you get it from?
My mother makes these for me. I have like 6 or 7 of these. During the winter months when it's cold, I wear these, and my mother makes them with her own hand. So, anyways, enough talking about our appearance. Let's talk about the book that we are reviewing. So, John J. Mearsheimer, some even argued that he's not just a political scientist, but a superstar, a very controversial figure. In fact, the author of the book that we are going to discuss, the title of the book is The Great Delusion, published in 2018. The author of this book has been recently blacklisted by the Ukrainian government because he is accused of being a Russian propagandist, which is quite bizarre. But anyways, we will talk about that later. So, Ahmed-Waleed Kakar, you have read the book. I have read the book. What we're going to do in this show today is, first and foremost, we will cover the theory of international relations explained by John J. Mearsheimer in this book. Once we have covered the theory, then we will move on to the application of this theory to the American occupation of Afghanistan in the last 2 decades, but also how it is still applicable for the current American foreign policy towards Afghanistan. And briefly, we will also discuss how this is relevant to the situation in Ukraine. So obviously, we're not experts on Russia and Ukraine, but we'll just briefly touch up on that. So first and foremost, Ahmed-Waleed Kakar, maybe you can tell us who is John J. Mearsheimer?
So Mearsheimer is a German surname, right? But he's an American political scientist and basically a giant in international relations. He is a scholar, I believe, of the offensive realist school of international relations, so which is its own madhab within the broader science of international relations. And he's also, this isn't his first book or first famous book. He has also written on the Israel lobby and the US foreign policy, which is a very well-renowned book. I even know people in the Taliban that have read that book, right? So
Osama bin Laden recommended that book once.
Well, we're not helping Mearsheimer's case in terms of his blacklisting by the Ukrainian government. An apologist for Vladimir Putin and bin Laden But in any case, he's a very well-renowned scholar within his own school of international relations, and one of his colleagues, we could say, was also our guest on the Afghan Eye, Dr. William Ruger, who also identifies or aligns himself with the realist school of international relations. So I believe he is the R. Wendell Harrison Distinguished Service Professor at the University of Chicago and has been described as the most influential realist of his generation. That is from Wikipedia, but I think that does a good job of explaining the grandeur of Mearsheimer.
He is very he has been quoted extensively in a lot of other literature on international relations and political science. Like the list of citation of his work, it's enormous. But what is also very interesting is that Mearsheimer, as a scholar, obviously he's controversial because of his theory and how he explains American foreign policy. But he identifies as a liberal. So we are going to talk about liberalism, the philosophy, how it's applied to international relations. But this is not a book written by someone who doesn't believe in liberalism. As a matter of fact, he actually claims that he's very grateful for the fact that he was born and raised and still lives in a liberal democracy. But this book is a academic work where liberalism is being examined and analyzed as a theory and a philosophy, belief system, and how it's applied to society and international relations. And what is interesting for us here at the Afghan Eye is how does the theory of Mearsheimer apply to Afghanistan? So, Waleed, first and foremost, I would like to ask you, what was your first impression when you started reading the book?
I'll be honest with you, I really, really liked it. There were obviously parts of it with which I didn't agree or disagreed, which is natural. You're not going to agree with everything in any academic work. But what I liked about it is that his style almost reminded me of our own sort of style and approach to argumentation or making your point. So, for example, in our nationalism and ethno-nationalism podcast, we diverted like the first 45 minutes of it towards romanticism and the origins of nationalism, what it is. And I try to do the same thing in my articles as well. Before we discuss any idea, we need to fundamentally understand the roots and the underpinnings of the idea, the bare bones of it, right? So Mearsheimer, I believe the book has 8 chapters. The first 4 chapters are dedicated solely to liberalism as a philosophy, what its presuppositions are, basically going to first principles, what its presuppositions are, what its characteristics are, what defines it, how does it materialize in a political sense at home, and then how does it later on subsequently, which is obviously going to apply to Afghanistan, how it applies internationally as well. So I know a lot of people stopped reading after the first or second chapters because it sounded like philosophical hogwash, but I really, genuinely appreciated that because it helped me draw the lines subsequently in the book.
I would say that, this is also why I read this book twice, because, you study different philosophical traditions as a student, and whatever you study as a student, at a certain point you forget how some of the material that you have studied is applied to a particular political tradition as well. And this book is like, in my opinion, anyone who wants to study political science or international relations, this should be a primer. They should read this book in the first introduction course on international relations and political science. It's so well written, and it's so good at explaining liberalism. He's not trashing liberalism. He's not going like, oh, liberalism is trash and it's stupid and nonsense. No, he is a liberal. He believes in liberalism. However, he examines this belief system, what it
forensically.
Yes, forensically, and it is so good. It is such a brilliant way of discussing this matter, and that's why I had to read it twice. I really enjoyed it, and
it was so nice I had to do it twice.
Yes. So, okay, Waleed, basically, what does Mearsheimer argue in his book? How would you describe his main argument?
Okay, so what I would say is his argument and his critique of what he terms as American liberal hegemony in the post-Cold War era is not a Marxist argument or critique, because due to the primacy that it places on liberalism as an ideological force, he does concede and accept that liberalism and capitalism are complementary. In fact, he even uses the word hand in hand. However, a Marxist critique would be one that places economics front and center in any sort of assessment of the motivations of American liberal hegemony, as Mearsheimer terms it. What Mearsheimer is arguing is that liberalism as an ideology is inherently militaristic and has a crusader spirit, and I believe he uses terms like crusade, missionary, a missionary zeal and a spirit. He's basically saying that liberalism is inherently militaristic, has a crusader spirit wired into it, and this is what materialized in the post-Cold War era, where the United States was the sole superpower of the world, where the Soviet Union had been vanquished. Liberalism is whilst it places a very strong emphasis on individualism, it also, because the world is made up of individuals, that makes it universalist, and it makes it an ethos that we can term as expansionist, almost like a religion, like Christianity, like Islam. So what Mearsheimer basically says is that, and I really like this phrase, okay? The bread and butter of liberalism is the fact that human beings cannot find agreement based on reason on what constitutes the good life. And that is a phrase that is repeated repeatedly throughout the book, and it never gets boring because it is so succinct and yet so comprehensive. What constitutes the good life? Philosophers have been discussing it for millennia, religions have been going to war over it, and yet this is basically for him what liberalism is. Due to basically, there are two schools here, right? I'm not going to go too deep into the philosophy of this, but if you know your some of your philosophy, you know that Plato, for example, did not think that human beings have a blank slate in their minds. He believed that knowledge was inherent to every human being, and he employed the Socratic method, which was basically question, question, question. You ask the right questions and you get the answers of people, right? If you read Plato's work, you know this is what he did. And if you ask questions and people give you answers, it means that in some pre-eternity they existed and they knew these things, and it ties into the world of the forms and whatever. Now, liberalism, or a lot of philosophers believed in a tabula rasa, a clean slate, whereas human beings come into the world with a clean slate in their minds, and they form their beliefs and their views through their experience with the material world. And because every human being is unique and everyone's experiences with the material world is unique, everyone is going to have different beliefs. So there are no inherently held beliefs because there is a clean slate. This is basically a very dumbed down version of where we start off. Everyone has different experiences, and based on those experiences, their deductions and their beliefs will be different, right? Because human beings cannot find agreement on what constitutes the good life, a liberal state exists, right? So that the state can act as a night's watchman to prevent conflict, which is inevitable between individuals, so that these individuals do not go and harm each other. One of the brilliant things about this book is how it defines realism. Now, realism, a lot of the times, is sort of derided or dismissed as being Machiavellian, as being solely interested with the pursuit of national interest. But now the question comes, what is the national interest? Who defines the national interest? Through which lens do we judge the national interest? Is the national interest solely material? Right? Is it ideological? Or, for example, our neighboring country, Iran, diverts a lot of its resources at a time where a lot of the country is in poverty toward expanding Shiism over and across different borders. And a lot of Iranians agree with that, despite the fact that it may make them economically impoverished. Why? Because Twelver Shiism is considered, a national interest in and of itself, the preservation of which and the expansion of which is a good thing. Once again, it comes back to what constitutes the good life, right? In Afghanistan, I'm going to be a bit petty here, a large part of our compatriots, the national interest for them is achieved when we are occupied by superpowers, and the client regimes installed by those superpowers chant anti-Pakistan slogans. That is the national interest. Nothing exists over and beyond that, right? Now, what Mearsheimer does with respect to America, he basically says, look, the people in charge of, or to a large extent influencing the direction of foreign policy, view national interest through the lens of liberalism, through a missionary zeal, through a crusader spirit that is dedicated towards spreading liberalism across the world. Now, why do they want to do that? Because liberalism, I mentioned earlier universalist and expansionist, because liberalism places its entire focus and emphasis on what it terms as individual rights. Every human being, everywhere, has rights, a certain set of inalienable rights, coming back to the American Declaration of Independence. And so wherever these rights are not being afforded to people, individuals in different countries by their governments, that necessitates measures to be taken, whether it's war, whether it's sanctions, whether it's NGOs, whether it's occupations, because the primary focus here is on the rights of people far away. So, and the last thing I would say is that the point that I raised with respect to how we define national interests once again comes back to, it's a magnified instance of the reality of what Mearsheimer terms as our inability to come to a consensus on what constitutes the good life. If we can't define amongst ourselves what is good, then we can't come to a consensus on what the state should do that is upholding the good, that is Amr bil Ma'ruf, right? The liberal Amr bil Ma'ruf.
Very good. Okay, so the most important thing that comes to mind at this point is that he says individual rights is a central aspect of the liberal dogma. And he also explains where this idea of individual rights comes from. He mentions several Western philosophers of the Enlightenment who first started talking about individual rights. Now, when we talk about individual rights now, everyone is supposed to believe that those rights are universal. Okay? So everyone is supposed to believe that whatever has emerged as the definition of what individual rights are through the Western tradition, Western philosophical tradition, those are now universal rights, and the whole world, all different cultures, religions, regions, they all have to accept those individual rights. And whenever those rights are violated, it justifies
hostility of on a different spectrum. And here's the thing, here's what's crucial. Human beings are created with those rights. They are born with those rights. So states do not give those rights to the citizenry. Rather, the states take away those rights. They have those rights by default, and they are not granted them.
Yeah, and this is why it is so important to understand those first chapters of this book, because everything else that comes after those 4 chapters about the American foreign policy, its relationship with Russia, China, the Middle East, Afghanistan, everything can be understood once you understand how he defines liberalism, individual rights, and how it is seen through a liberal lens, and how this applies to national politics inside a liberal democracy, how within a liberal democracy you have the modus vivendi liberals and the progressive liberals. He explains the difference between these 2 dominant strands of liberalism to be very simple and shallow. The Republican Party could be defined to a certain degree as a modus vivendi liberal party, and the Democratic Party can be defined as a progressive liberal party. Maybe briefly you could explain the difference between modus vivendi and progressive liberal.
Sure. But before I do that, Sangar, there's one point that I really want to emphasize here on the point of individualism. Do you remember our podcast with Dr. William Ruger, who, by the way, Mearsheimer shouts out in the book, right? Do you remember I cracked a joke with him where he said that human beings, once they acquire a certain level of wealth, they're going to want this luxury and that luxury. And I said, as a joke, I said, utilitarianism, right? And I don't think he got the joke because he was like, no, right? Now, the thing is that Mearsheimer is very keen to distinguish liberalism from other ideologies with one particular facet, that facet being individualism. There is no liberalism without individualism, to the extent that ideas like utilitarianism, which are often conflated with liberalism, become totally divorced. Because whilst utilitarianism may say, a liberal democratic system is great and this and that and whatever, ultimately what it comes down to is pleasure versus pain, as Jeremy Bentham, its founding father, put it. But in the instance that there is greater utility to be held in a dictatorial regime, right? Utilitarianism will go that way. Basically, whatever works. Whereas liberalism's emphasis is almost on a religious level, is on the individual. If there is no individualism, there is no liberalism. This is its defining characteristic. That is one thing I want to make absolutely clear. Now that we've defined that, we can go to modus vivendi versus modus vivendi. For those, it's a Latin term basically to mean a way of operating between 2 or more parties. So once we come to liberalism, which there are 2 sorts, modus vivendi and progressive. Progressives have a greater belief and faith in the state to socially engineer society. Progressive liberals are the type that would say, look, human beings have all of these rights. They have the right to assembly. They have the right to freedom of belief, but they can't have these rights if they're not alive. So let's guarantee free healthcare, right? Let's do this. And, this marginalized community cannot have freedom of assembly if it's poor and marginalized. Therefore, we need to use the state to engineer a mechanism by which XYZ marginalized group can become more equal and thus gain a greater share of its God-given rights. By the way, in its origin, these rights were considered God-given. It may not be fashionable today, but God, man was created. It was very clear, right? Modus vivendi liberals very much have a conceptualization of rights as being negative, as in individuals have the right to be free of, right, oppression. They have, so in the instance that they assemble or they have a certain belief. So it's very much The state guarantees that I live, and that's it, right? Other than that, I don't care about the equality stuff. It's not the state's place. Neither is it within the state's capacity or capability to make sure that this group and that group is no longer marginalized. It should be a free society, free economy, as small a state as possible. Mearsheimer says that because of the nature of the global economy and the nature of modernity today, progressive liberals have won. And modus vivendi liberals, whilst they're there, they are there and they are a constituency, the most that they can aim for in this current paradigm is to basically mitigate the worst instincts of progressive liberals who are, let's say, predisposed toward an interventionist role for the state.
And now we see a lot of people talking about neoliberalism nowadays. There is a lot of talk about neoliberalism, and you see in the popular discourse, especially in the English language, by the Americans, whenever they talk about liberal, they tend to mean progressives. But in this book, what is being explained is the dominant belief system of Western society, which is philosophical liberalism. It's not just the progressive, it's not just people who advocate for what is defined as positive rights, such as, equality of opportunity and equality of outcome and whatnot. No, this is much bigger than that. So what is also very important for people who may be interested in understanding communism is that communism essentially also shares the same roots as liberalism, as a philosophy, as a belief system. You could argue that there is a lot of similarities between progressive liberalism and communism. They're not identical because there are different strands of political thought, but there are similarities. And what is also very interesting is that whenever we talk about politics, especially in Afghanistan, what Mearsheimer says, what constitutes the good life? And
what a phrase.
Yes. And what constitutes the good life? Whenever we have disagreements and whenever we have people basically totally losing their minds in comments on our videos and Twitter, essentially what everything comes down to is disagreement about what constitutes the good life. And whenever we talk about these matters, I personally ignore a lot of comments and questions because, the comment section or the tweets, they're not sufficient to explain these matters. Like, I am not going to bother explaining what constitutes the good life on Twitter with people. Okay? I expect people to basically read, reject, and ignore me if they disagree. And if anybody really wants to understand other arguments, well, maybe they can listen to the podcast. Okay?
I have an example of this. It was, in our podcast with Dr. Ruger, he said, he himself said that he was of the opinion that the initial decision to invade Afghanistan was not the wrong decision. And I just sort of nodded along. And the reason I nodded along is because ultimately what it comes down to is that Dr. William Ruger and I, to some extent, disagree on what constitutes the good life, which, in the course of human history is a very common thing. So we may not resolve that in a podcast, and we certainly won't resolve it in 280 characters on Twitter.
And what's interesting, you referred to Ruger. Ruger said that the initial decision to invade Afghanistan was justified. And what the Mearsheimer school of thought is in international relations is that exactly that. Whenever we are attacked, whenever any country is attacked, whenever they are being threatened by any external hostile force, then they're justified to use force. That's what they believe. So even when they talk about Russia, Ukraine, or whatever, it doesn't mean that they are pacifists or that they want to submit to violence from external forces. Nothing of that is the case with these guys. But let's carry on. Before we move to the international relations parts, I wanted to ask you another question. So we discussed basically how he structures his argument. We discussed how he defines political liberalism. And in chapter 4, he talks about cracks in the liberal edifice. Could you briefly talk about that, please?
Sure. But there's one thing, however, there I have one contention against something that you said, which is that Dr. Mearsheimer is a liberal. I would dispute that. The reason I would dispute that is because what did we say is the fundamental? Perhaps you missed, and this is the thing. In the book, he does not come out and say, "I am not a liberal," right?
Actually, he does. He does. In the beginning of the book, he does say that he's a liberal.
Okay, but listen, I contend that he is not a liberal, and I'm doing this by inference, okay? So we agree that liberalism is characterized and defined by individualism, right? Okay. Now, as in the belief that human beings are individuals first, and later they are part of social political groups, the individual is king. But then Mearsheimer says repeatedly throughout the book that liberalism always loses out to nationalism and realism. Because he says in chapter 2, because human beings are social animals, right? So if human beings are social animals and liberalism is all about individualism, right? Then it means that what I basically took from this is that he's basically saying that a liberal democratic system has many merits and values, and he's, very lucky to have been born in an advantageous circumstance like that. But if he himself is saying that human beings are social animals, and that's why nationalism beats liberalism, and that is why liberalism exists under a nation state, it means he's basically refuting the idea that human beings are individuals first, because he's saying they're social animals.
Okay, right? I give up. You're right. I was wrong.
Okay.
Even though he says he's a liberal, because he identifies human beings essentially as social animals and not as individuals, he is not really a liberal. Okay.
Exactly. Not philosophically a liberal. Maybe in his politics he's a liberal, right? It could be possible that he could be a utilitarian. Perhaps he believes that this is the best way of maximizing pleasure and minimizing pain. But if human beings are social animals, well, the philosophical liberalism goes out of the window and you are off the manhaj, right?
Definitely. So cracks in the liberal edifice.
So there are a couple of things here that he basically says in terms of critiquing liberalism, right? First of all, he says that if the idea, and this once again goes to the point of his lack of philosophical liberalism, he says all of these great philosophers, Aristotle, Plato, Machiavelli, none of them believed in this concept of individual rights, right? And because maybe as a result that Aristotle, for example, did not believe in individual rights, he actively believed, Aristotle, that an interventionist government should exist to create good people. This is the complete opposite of liberalism, which basically says that it's not the government's business. At the same time, he refers to, for example, John Locke, the founding father, we could say, of liberalism, who also formulated and wrote about the tabula rasa, the fact that human beings are born with a clean slate. Locke, in his liberal, let's say, utopia, right, excluded atheists and Catholics. Atheists could not be trusted because they don't have anything to swear by. Catholics, their ultimate loyalty was to the king. And you actually see the latest iteration of this contemporarily when a lot of these Western European societies are very paranoid about large population of Muslims, because they're saying, look, their ultimate loyalty is not to the liberal state, it is to other than the state. So it's not something that we could say is uniquely excluded just to Locke's writings in the 17th century, but we see this repeating and perpetuating itself continuously. He goes on in chapter 4 and he says, the USA was basically Project Liberalism in a laboratory. It was created as the liberal state. Yet even in the USA, liberalism and the preoccupation with the rights of individuals overseas is primarily an elite exercise. Average Americans, and he actually uses some statistical data, do not really care about the rights of someone in Helmand. And if people in America really did believe in individualism, once again, he uses statistics and data for this, they would not be more upset by Americans dying than Afghans, Pakistanis, Somalis, Yemenis, and so on and so forth dying, because these are all individuals, right? So he's basically saying liberalism operates under the nation state. The nation state is a byproduct of nationalism. Therefore, liberalism lives under nationalism, so it's subservient to nationalism. In the country, in the liberal nation state itself, it is predominantly an elite exercise. Furthermore, he goes on, for example, gives a lot of the history of the slavery of African Americans, of segregation, of the internment of Germans and Japanese during the First and the Second World Wars. And one of the arguments that was actually very profound was that if everyone had individual rights, right, why would these people in all of these countries be fighting against their individual rights being imported to them by the Americans? So if everyone has these rights, why are people fighting attempts to bring about a political system for them? So liberalism, and this is another contradiction that he notices, liberalism is predicate, and it's not, to be fair, it's not just him to notice this. The illiberalism of liberalism is something that's very, very sort of been dissected. And by the way, not by Ahmed-Waleed Sangar, not by Sangar Paikar, not by another Muslim-looking guy with a beard and a turban or with a surname Muhammad, but by Europeans. This guy's surname is Mearsheimer. It's not Muhammad. So to all of the Afghans that are going to be watching this and getting very angry, you can't call this guy a terrorist. You may be able to get away with it with me, right? Mearsheimer is a German, and as far as I'm aware, definitely not of Islamist tendencies.
Yeah. And this is what he looks like for the guys who may be still thinking that he is Achi John. No, he's really a white American cisgender,
Anglo-Saxon, straight.
Yes. Yes.
Protestant, perhaps.
Yes.
So this is the thing. So notice this, Sangar. Notice how, and once again, this isn't just Mearsheimer that's noticed this. Liberalism predicates itself on the fact that there needs to be a force that maintains peace amongst individuals who are incapable of finding consensus on what constitutes the good life, right? At the same time, political liberalism overseas wants every country to have the same political system to give people its rights, thereby defining what the good life is. Now, let me say that one more time. Individuals cannot come to a consensus on the good life. So they need a state, right, to ensure that there's peace amongst them. At the same time, you want every state in the world to have a certain political system to ensure peace amongst individuals. But if you want everyone to follow one thing, you have defined the good life, which you have just said, consensus on which can never be found. So this is essentially, if liberalism were natural, if rights were universal, they wouldn't need to be enforced by America through invasions or sanctions. And if they were universal, liberal hegemony wouldn't find armed struggle or jihad against it in the countries that it invades.
And here is just short, briefly, here is the resemblance between communists and liberals, because in Afghanistan, when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, the communists in Afghanistan, they did not say the people are resisting us. No, those people were not smart enough to understand what constitutes the good life. They were being fooled, and they were being manipulated by the imperialist West, because obviously, if they were smart enough, if they were intellectual elites like the communists, they would never resist, and they would never. So basically, what Mearsheimer here explains about liberalism is the exact same thing we saw with communism in Afghanistan.
Exactly. And so finally, what Mearsheimer's final contention is when it comes, and this is where it comes to the realm of international relations. So far, I've kind of veered away from that. We're just looking at the domestic sort of generally. Liberalism works domestically, where there are a collection of individuals, right? And they need a state above them to prevent conflict. And there are generally three ways in which conflict is minimized. First of all, the emphasis on everyone's rights, the emphasis on tolerance, and finally, the night watchman, if anything were to go wrong. Internationally, the night watchman doesn't exist, right? The international order is anarchic, not hierarchical. So at home, and perhaps some people may find it tedious that I'm explaining things again and emphasizing things again, but I want to be really certain that, people that have never read a philosophy or politics book really understand this. In Great Britain, for example, we have the state above us. So if someone wants to shoot me because I don't believe that the NRF is the solution for Afghanistan, the state comes in to protect me and to minimize conflict, because me and that individual cannot find a consensus on what constitutes the good life. There's a state above us. Internationally, there is no state above states. This is the key point. And you may say the United Nations, right? To which I would say, oh dear me. So this is basically it. And finally, I'm going to come to basically wrap this bit up, is that he basically, because of all of these things, Mearsheimer says that liberalism, whilst we may associate it with conflict resolution and minimization and prosperity and economic interdependence and peace and respect and tolerance, right? Mearsheimer contends that it's militaristic. And it's militaristic for 5 reasons. Number one is the impulse to democratize. There is an impulse hardwired into the liberal ethos to democratize, spread, basically be crusading projects. George Bush himself used the word crusade against Iraq, right? He literally used the word crusade. Secondly, liberalism is militaristic because it has the assumption that liberal states have a right and a responsibility to use military force to achieve its goals. Thirdly, liberal policymakers are fanatic and have a missionary zeal. Fourth, liberal hegemony makes diplomacy hard because when you're hegemonic, you're not really going to be amenable to listening to the other side. And if you're a missionary at the same time and you're zealous, it makes it even harder. Finally, liberal hegemony cuts against nationalism because of its interference in other countries' sovereign affairs, and thereby worsens relations between them, thereby paving the way for war. Finally, there's one other point I wanted to mention. Margaret Thatcher, in a very famous quote, once said, "There is no such thing as society. There are individuals." And Margaret Thatcher, if you know your British politics or even your international politics, together with Reagan, known as the Iron Lady, is seen as, the godmother of neoliberalism, an attempt to go back toward, let's say, modus vivendi liberalism that we discussed earlier. So if there's one thing I want people to take away from this, it's that liberalism is essentially encapsulated by Margaret Thatcher in that one thing. There is no such thing as society. There are just individuals. And with that, Sangar, would you agree we've got a pretty firm grip on what liberalism is?
Yes. So, you know, when I was a first year student of public administration, we had a professor who was a professor of sociology, but he was teaching a course on public administration. And he said, theories are like tools. Like, whatever we teach you is like a tool shed. You have all these different tools, and you can use them as a tool to go and try to analyze and open and see under the bonnet of all sorts of stuff. So everything that you have covered so far provides us with enough tools to now talk about the application of liberalism as a foreign policy to Afghanistan. Now, first and foremost, I think it is very important to understand that when we talk about foreign policy, any state, any government that engages in international relations, it has to justify its actions based on something that is convincing to the people of that particular country. Okay? So what that basically means is that if you have a liberal democracy, like in the United States or here in Europe, and the government decides that they are going to wage war or they're going to impose sanctions or whatever, the government needs to justify its actions based on the belief system that is dominant in a society. Otherwise, the people will not vote for the ruling party. Okay? So this means that whatever is the American foreign policy, it is also a reflection of the dominant beliefs of the American society. And this is why when you see all these previous chapters that were just covered in this podcast, everything was intended to explain the belief system of the nation states that engaged in international relations. So, first and foremost, I would say, Walid, in your how you have read the book, do you think that this book is applicable to what has happened in Afghanistan in the last 2 decades? And to what extent would you say that it's applicable?
So I think there are elements that can be expanded upon, certainly. So the role of media, for example. But I'm willing to accept that this is an exercise in the book focusing primarily on the levers of power. And media, it can be considered soft power, notwithstanding its significance, but that it wouldn't really fall under the remit of its book. However, at the same time, I would contend that the role of the media is so significant that you really can't minimize it here. So sort of discussing the role of media in this is certainly a discussion to have. But with respect to Afghanistan, I think there are a number of themes that directly apply. First and foremost is social engineering. Now, to be clear, there's a quote in the book where Mearsheimer says, states want nations and nations want states, right? And states have an inherent, inbuilt impetus to socially engineer their nations for the purpose, not necessarily for sinister purposes, but to make sure that governing becomes easier by way of, let's say, standardizing a language or languages, by, formulating educational curriculum, all of these sorts of things. However, he actually says that culture, and he actually goes very deeply into cultures, how cultures are determined by, a certain group's environment, the weather, their prosperity or their lack thereof, their food. So cultures themselves are remarkably deeply rooted within the societies within which they operate. So socially engineering them oftentimes is very difficult for the rulers of those societies. We know, for example, how difficult the rulers of Afghanistan have found it to try socially engineering Afghanistan. You could say all of them failed. I wouldn't say, I mean, that's a discussion we could have another time, but it's certainly a point that you could make that all of them failed. So in a time where local rulers are struggling to socially engineer their societies. And if you go over to Wael Halak, who's basically saying that the states that we refer to as failed states in the project of modernity are the ones that cannot homogenize. And homogenization is social engineering. So the states that are the worst at social engineering are what we call failed states, right? What Mearsheimer says is that if it's bad enough for local rulers to socially engineer their states, because liberal policymakers are dogmatic and zealous, they assume that they don't just have the responsibility, but they have the capability alongside it to socially engineer these societies. And I feel that that is something which was felt very keenly in Afghanistan, which explains why, even if people didn't join the Taliban, they had a very healthy dosage of apprehension toward the government and its foreign patrons.
Okay, so now I'm going to ask you a question. First and foremost, okay? Before we talk about the American invasion of Afghanistan and how the occupation was justified for 20 years and how they still use the same arguments and the same rhetoric and the same belief system to justify their current foreign policy towards Afghanistan. Before we do all of that, I want to ask you briefly, before the end of the Cold War, because this book basically explains how the liberal hegemony has came into prevalence after the end of the Cold War, but during the Cold War, when the United States supported the Afghan Mujahideen against Soviet Union, was it because of liberalism or maybe something else? How would you answer that?
I think it was both. I think both of them converged. The thing is that the way that these things work, in my opinion, is not either or. And this is something that Mearsheimer himself points towards. So, for example, he says that one of the goals of liberal hegemony and expansion is to foster economic intercourse, as he calls it. And that in and of itself is a liberal goal, because liberalism is also about trade, free trade, economic interactions, and so on. Now, if you're a Marxist, you will say, no, it was all about the economics. You see, but a lot of the times these things can complement each other. So with respect to Afghanistan, the public enemy number one is communism. Communism, why? Because it violates rights, individual rights, and so on and so forth. Communism needs to be defeated.
I would argue that the primary reason why the United States supported the Mujahideen in Afghanistan is because of their realpolitik. The Americans saw the Soviet Union as an expansionist enemy that was directly threatening the American interests, and that's why they supported them, okay? And I agree with what you said about how they had also a liberal justification of that support, because communism was on an expansionist belief system that also threatened trade and individual rights. I agree with that. But to what extent would you say that the Americans were influenced in the way they see politics by that experience with Afghanistan during the Cold War, the Soviet-Afghan War?
Heavily.
And how would you define that?
I would say that the attempts at social engineering were much less heavy, hand heavy, much more smart, much more indirect, much more of a lighter touch.
Okay, so the reason why I asked this question is before I started reading Mearsheimer for a second time, I was actually reading Charlie Wilson's War, and I was reading the other book, which the title of that book is The Great Gamble. Both books are about the Afghan Soviet War. One is written about the American experience, Charlie Wilson's War, and The Great Gamble is from a Soviet Union perspective. Both books are obviously written by Americans, so both books have very strong American influence. But what I'm trying to say is that before the end of Cold War, the way the Americans saw Afghanistan and the way they engaged with Afghanistan, it was not like, okay, the Afghans, they are religious conservative jihadists and they believe in liberalism and we are going to support them because of the spread of liberalism. That was absolutely not their main driving, like it wasn't driving their decision and desire in the way it later became more prevalent.
I would agree.
Okay. Now, there's something else that is also important about the Cold War era and liberalism that is also relevant, that is going to become relevant in the future questions that I'm going to ask you. So here's the thing. In this book, Mearsheimer says that the Americans abolished Jim Crow and segregation because they could not hold a straight face towards Soviet Union and point the finger at the Soviet Union and say, you are violating individual rights, while in their own country, in the United States, they were treating black people as inferior. So the Cold War, the competition between the liberal West and the communist Soviet Union actually shaped the way the Americans and the Europeans saw individual rights, equal rights, equality, human rights. Now, that was only 50, 60 years ago. Okay? So now, if we're going to talk about the end of Cold War, the 1990s, first, what happened in the 1990s? The communist government in Afghanistan collapsed. The Mujahideen took over. The Soviet Union collapsed. The Americans were no longer interested in what was happening in Afghanistan. It was not in their, how would you say?
Radar.
It was not on their radar. So individual rights in Afghanistan, women's rights, rights of the minorities, religious minorities, women's education, all these matters, it didn't matter at all. Up until the Taliban takeover in 1996, because when that happened, Bill Clinton was president, and his wife, Hillary Clinton, the first lady, she was the first American politician who started heavily focusing on individual rights in Afghanistan, particularly women's rights, as a battle cry and as a reason for America to become more engaged with Afghanistan. And this is a chapter prior to the occupation that a lot of people may forget. It wasn't like, oh, the Americans suddenly discovered Afghanistan after 9/11. Prior to that, in the 1990s, the Democratic presidential candidate, Bill Clinton, once he became president, not in his first term, but in his second term, that's when the Taliban took over Afghanistan, and that's also when his wife, the First Lady, Hillary Clinton, started writing extensively about women's rights in Afghanistan, and this became an important topic for the American media, the American establishment, but also the European Union. Around the same era, it was when Ahmad Shah Massoud traveled to Europe. He came to Europe and talked to European politicians, and he also made an appeal to liberal values and liberal beliefs, individual rights. Okay?
Funny how that works.
Yes, so this is an important part of the history before the US invasion that we have to bear in mind, because this also signifies a huge change in perspective in the West regarding Afghanistan. Because why would they not care about women's rights and education and all these matters in the 1980s? Because obviously Soviet Union does social engineering. The Soviet Union, by the force of the state, imposes that everyone becomes educated, that women go to school. Back then, these matters were not seen through the same lens and through the same light. But after the 1990s, suddenly things changed. And how would you explain that? In your opinion, what caused that change? It is mentioned in this book.
What caused that change after previous indifference toward Afghanistan? That is not 9/11.
Francis Fukuyama.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Please elaborate why Francis Fukuyama's name is significant here.
Francis Fukuyama wrote a book, pamphlet, whatever.
First
called
he
The
wrote
End.
an article, and then
Yes.
he elaborated it into a book.
Because it was so wildly successful. Essentially, I referred to Hegelian terminology and philosophy in my article on education, where Francis Fukuyama Hegel was of the opinion that there was an ongoing human dialectic whereby society was constantly progressing, not peacefully, not amicably, but that ideas constantly clashed with each other via human beings, and ultimately the most successful one would basically carry forth the torch of progress and enlightenment and development and all things good. Now, Francis Fukuyama, perhaps he knew that Hegel wrote that, perhaps he didn't, but Francis Fukuyama basically said, with the end of the Cold War and with the defeat of Soviet communism, that this was the end of history. And he used that phrase specifically. He said, this is the end. Liberal democracy has won. Liberal democracy will be spread around the world. Almost, it's like the second coming of Isa alayhi salam, where after which everyone is prophesied to become Muslim. That is, of course, some people dispute the second coming of Jesus, but in any case, it's a very messianic, apocalyptic sort of prophecy that Francis Fukuyama put forth, that this was, and I quote, the end of history.
Okay, now, why was that article so popular at that particular time is because first we had in the 20th century, for the most part, you had the West, the liberal West, opposing Nazis, and then later the communists. And when all of that ended, the Western society needed to have a belief system, the other, how do you say, the otherization?
Yes.
The other that needs to be changed, that was absent when Soviet Union collapsed. And in the 1990s, something very significant happened that also is mentioned in this book. It is the publication of Clash of Civilization by Huntington. Samuel Huntington, he published a book about the Clash of Civilization. That book is also part of the international relations discourse. In that book, Huntington basically says that there is always, essentially, a clash of civilizations, and during the Cold War, it was a clash between the West under the leadership of United States against Soviet Union. But since that, the red civilization has collapsed, now the next enemy of Western civilization is going to be Islam. That's what Samuel Huntington predicted in 1998 when that book was published. So
His Majesty King Charles disagrees. Just want to put that out there.
You mentioned that, I think, in the last podcast, right?
In the article as well.
Yes. So this is the important historical context of the 1990s, and after that, obviously, 9/11 attacks provided the justification for a offensive, a realist action by the Americans, as Mearsheimer describes that, and also his friend William Ruger agrees that the Americans were, in their perspective, justified by invading and attacking in Afghanistan. But then what happened is that they started a process of nation building, a long-term occupation.
Despite the misgivings of Donald Rumsfeld, by the way.
Yes. And this is a topic that we will discuss in some other podcast about how Donald Rumsfeld and the modus vivendi liberal party of George Bush suddenly became involved in nation building and protecting individual rights in other parts of the world. That's a different discussion. But what is important, that this is a major switch in perspective in America and other Western countries, because suddenly we saw in the media, the New York Times repeatedly publishing articles about how Afghan women are oppressed, how minorities are oppressed, the religious minorities are oppressed in Afghanistan. And in order to ensure individual rights in Afghanistan, the American taxpayer had to pay. The American taxpayer had to pay in order to make sure that everyone in Afghanistan has the exact same rights as the United States or Europe. Like, even if you talk to Afghans who supported the occupation, they would say, listen, the Americans, they defeated Nazi Germany and they defeated Japan. And then Japan became an industrial superpower, and Germany is right now the most powerful, and they call it the engine or the motor of Europe. So we have to side with the Americans. We have to support them to create a liberal democracy in Afghanistan so that we become like Germany and Japan.
And South Korea.
But here's the thing. Mearsheimer, in his book, he explains under which condition a society becomes democratic and liberal. He describes a few important characteristics of a society that is democratic and liberal. First and foremost, a society needs to be in a very high stage of homogenization. The society needs to be in a very advanced stage of homogenization. You see that, for example, in France, there is one standard language, French, while before the Enlightenment that was not the case. Different regions of France could not understand each other. A lot of people, they don't know that. Even in Germany, like, the German language is homogenized. But it wasn't the case. So this is a condition. You need to have a homogenized society. People need to all speak the same language. If there are too many different ethnic groups, too many different religious beliefs, different customs, then it is very difficult to create a liberal democratic society. What is also important is that
there's another way you could phrase this. Ibn Khaldun also said that the more groups within a territory, the more difficult it becomes to govern. And why is that? Because the more groups and the more diversity, the more room there is for disagreement on what constitutes the good life.
Okay, so when you know that Afghanistan has never had a very powerful centralized government and a advanced developed bureaucracy, it didn't have a standard tax system and standard curriculum in schools. The society was never homogenized in a way these countries like Japan, prior to the Second World War, Japan was an empire. Most Japanese were educated. It was an industrial superpower. They could build their own submarines and whatnot. The same thing applied with Germany. So these are matters that a lot of people, they don't accept. However, when the Americans invaded Afghanistan in 2001, all this knowledge, all these facts about how the liberal democratic society has emerged, all these matters were thrown out of the window, and they went to, no, we are going to just socially engineer Afghanistan. We're going to just pump aid money into it and then create a liberal democracy in Afghanistan. The exact same way when communists decided that the Marxist theory about industrial revolution and everything doesn't apply to Russia. We're just going to have a violent revolution and massacre everyone and then create a socialist utopia. The same thing happened in 2001 when they invaded Afghanistan. All their prior knowledge about how their society has evolved and emerged and how these values, like the reason why I refer to racism in America, like they didn't stop being racist towards black people out of their benevolence, out of their enlightenment. Oh, we're so enlightened, we're so smart, we're so rational. Of course, we shouldn't be racist. No. They discovered that they shouldn't be racist because otherwise their arguments against Soviet Union wouldn't make much sense.
In fact, the racism and the slavery thing was even a factor during the American War of Independence, but they thought, let's kick the can down the road because we want to be united against the British. So yes. it's not even that they had no understanding that this was potentially troublesome. No. Thomas Jefferson knew that, this is going to be morally questionable, right? But for political reasons, it was a can that was kicked down the road. So, yeah, it just goes to your point. It wasn't sort of a sudden epiphany.
So this is why it is important to have historic knowledge about how belief systems have evolved, how those belief systems have become dominant, and how those belief systems eventually are translated into foreign policy. Because once the Bush administration in 2001 decided to invade Afghanistan, at that moment we have the speeches, they're still online on YouTube, how the rhetoric slowly changed. Suddenly it wasn't just about defeating Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, no, it was creating a liberal
Afghan
democracy.
Girls and boys going to school. Democracy. I referenced it in my article as well, George Bush's thing, and it was all equated together: defeating the Taliban, girls going to schools, liberal democracy, la 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 la.
And you have a few of these maxims that they have. They, like, for example, they say, "Injustice anywhere is injustice everywhere." Something like
we're
that.
We're not equal until we're all equal.
Yes, like these slogans that they have, which is used to basically justify a perpetual war against the rest of the world. That's basically.
I'm just going to hold you there. I got a quote of Francis Fukuyama from the famous article in the National Interest. This is dated summer 1989. And I quote, "What we may be witnessing is not just the end of the Cold War or the passing of a particular period of post-war history. but the end of history as such. That is, the end point of mankind's ideological evolution and the universalization of Western liberal democracy as the final form of human government.
And
End quotes.
This is very typical of the liberal intellectual. They are so in love with themselves that they think, I got it all figured out. Of course.
Well, this is the thing. This is why I think it's always important to refer to Hegel, because other sort of philosophers are not as important as he is, in the sense that there's always an ongoing dialectic. There's always a back and forth, and there emerges a winner which clashes with a new ideology and a new ideology until finally you get the end of history. But with social engineering in mind, Sangar, Mearsheimer in this book, there are about 2-3 questions I want to ask you here before we wrap this up. Mearsheimer in this book mentions NGOs, but he only mentions NGOs with respect to great powers like Russia, like China. So, for example, this is the quote, right? A liberal unipole is unlikely to use military power to protect individual rights or foster regime change in a major power, mainly because the costs are too high. Nevertheless, it is likely to interfere in that country's politics in other ways. Its tactics might include relying on non-governmental organizations to support certain institutions and politicians inside the target state, linking aid, membership in international institutions, and trade to the major power's human rights record, and shaming the target state by publicly reporting its human rights violations. Now, if we take the major power bit out of that, how does that apply to Afghanistan? It is likely to interfere in the country's politics, tactics that might include relying on NGOs to support certain institutions and politicians, linking aid, membership in international institutions, and trade to human rights. Does this apply to Afghanistan?
So prior to 9/11, they did not want to recognize the Taliban as the legitimate government of Afghanistan because one of the arguments that was brought forward, they do not respect human rights. The fact that China was in the UN Security Council and violating the rights of millions of people, that did not prevent.
I mean, technically, you could say billions. You could technically say billions.
Yes, that did not prevent the United States and their liberal allies from sanctioning China and kicking them out of the UN Security Council. No, because China had atomic bombs. But when it applies to a weak and poor country, suddenly they become very moralistic. Very moralistic. Oh, you must respect human rights, otherwise you cannot play along with us, be part of the liberal international community. You're not allowed to do that. But once they invaded Afghanistan, then everything was in their hands. They installed the government. They decided who is going to be president. Even when there were elections, eventually John Kerry had to travel to Afghanistan to pick one of the two candidates and say, okay, you're going to be president and you're going to be the whatever it was, CEO, whatever. And this happened twice. During elections, Americans intervened. So even when they had given the country that they have created sovereignty, they had to even pick who's going to be president after the elections. And you talked about NGOs. Like, okay, the USID, when they were providing...
USAID, by the way.
USAID, when they were providing aid to Afghanistan, it was all conditioned based on liberal dogmas. For example, there is a guy who commented on Twitter. I think I showed you that. He said, I was in Afghanistan in 2002. In a village, we had to build a facility for people. And we applied for a grant at the USAID. And we didn't get the grant because they said, how many women do you employ from that village in realizing this project? So they had to, basically, they had to go into a village in rural Afghanistan and ask women to be part of a building project. Otherwise, they wouldn't get the money. Now, what does this mean? What it essentially means that as long as you play along with those rules and requirements of the liberals, you can get whatever you want. And this is how basically promoting liberalism actually facilitated corruption in Afghanistan, because the conditions in Afghanistan to become a liberal society were not met. The society was not homogenized, there was no central government, all these things that are mentioned by Mearsheimer as conditions for a country to be liberal and democratic. None of those things were present, but they did have these demands, and these NGOs were promoting these values, and in exchange for that, you would get financial benefits. What also...
The reason that Toulon News owes its initial grants to the Moby Group, and Toulon as an organization also got, I believe, hundreds of thousands from USAID, yes.
The media was created in Afghanistan and entirely depended on grants, because obviously a free press is essential for a liberal democracy. Therefore, in order to have a free press, the Americans, the occupiers, their allies, they had to pay for the media, because the media was free and independent in Afghanistan. But all their money came from Western taxpayers. And
what is the Dedi saying that we use?
Yes, whoever.
He who feeds orders.
And bear in mind, in Farsi, it's gender neutral, eh? It's not necessarily he, it can be she.
Okay. We're in 2100, very progressive.
Farsi is the most progressive language in the world.
درود یزدان پاک بر همه شما باد.
So, just one last point about media. Just last point about the media. So, one has to accept and acknowledge and understand that promotion of liberalism entirely depends on media, okay? And financial grants, okay? Money and media are very important in promoting liberalism. First and foremost, we have Voice of America, financed by the American State Department, foreign policy. Finances media. It's so-called free media, but it's actually an extension of American foreign policy. The same thing applies to...
It is an arm of the American state.
Yes. The American state provides funding for USAID. USAID funds all these other media in Afghanistan, Toulon and whatnot. Then you have Radio Free Europe, its branch for Afghanistan, Mashal and
Radio
Azadi. All their money, all their funding comes from the United States or the British Embassy in Afghanistan. All these countries who are engaging in liberal foreign policy, basically they're waging war to promote liberalism. They are financially funding all these institutions that promote their values, their beliefs. Nothing is free. It's all political. It's all driven by an agenda. And this is why you can never say that these liberal democratic societies respect freedom of speech, because it wasn't free. It was specifically paid for to promote their agenda and justify occupation, justify war in Afghanistan, perpetual war, because otherwise, well, if we stop fighting in Afghanistan, what's going to happen to human rights? What is going to happen to women's rights? We have to wage war. The fact that the war itself kills so many people, creates so many...
Deprives people of their right to live.
That, like, even right now, they have imposed sanctions on Afghanistan. They do not recognize this government. So the people in Afghanistan are being collectively punished, deprived of their own money and ability to survive because their government is not liberal and democratic. It doesn't respect individual rights, so that's why they have to going to pay collectively for the sin of not having a liberal government. So killing people in Afghanistan by starvation is justified by the same liberal world order that believes in individual rights. So the individual in Afghanistan is being punished, basically being murdered, because that individual's individual rights are not being respected. This is the essence of American liberal foreign policy towards Afghanistan right now. Would you agree or disagree?
I can't find anything to disagree. And one of the things that we get continuously asked about, Sangar, is why can I read the books you guys read? So with the media in mind, manufacturing consent by a certain someone called Noam Chomsky. And finally, Sangar, there's another thing, and this is what I always sort of come to when it comes to sort of liberalism, human rights, individual rights, women's rights, minority rights, right? And in Afghanistan, minority rights is a drum that is often banged. Minority rights, women, and the assumption is that this all happens under the same overarching umbrella, in tandem, in sync, and in harmony with each other. But there is one example here that is a total eyesore. In fact, it will make your eyes bleed, right, if you actually paid attention to it. So in 2009, there was I don't know too much of the details, which bill and which clause of the penal code, this stuff I don't know. But essentially, there was a law that was being passed through the then Afghan parliament with respect to marital rape according to the Shia Jafari madhab.
Yes.
Now, once again, during these podcasts, I always speak, as if all of the listeners have a tabula rasa, a clean slate. They don't know anything. So the Shia Jafari madhab is the predominant legal school of, I think it's the only legal school, to the extent that I know, it's the principal legal school of the 12 of Shia. And there were some clauses in the Jafari school, which was, I'm going to be very, very sensible here, which were considered to or perceived as opening the way toward marital rape. Okay, now Afghanistan is an overwhelmingly Sunni majority country, so the people that would be affected by this would be the minority Shia. As in, according to this law, it was possible that avenues toward marital rape could be opened up in accordance with the religious customs and laws of a religious minority, rightly or wrongly. Now, this caused an uproar, Sangar, because why? Women's rights were now being violated. So in enshrining and upholding minority rights, what was being alleged is that you're trampling on women's rights. And as is what unfolded, President Hamid Karzai basically backtracked on this law, so in order to uphold women's rights. But in upholding women's rights, he trampled on a minority community's right to regulate itself in accordance with their own religious custom and tradition. Which way is the liberal way? Which way is the right way? It was a question that was asked then, not answered, and it's a question I'm asking now, and no one's going to be able to answer it. So the point I'm trying to make is that the lens through which we view Afghanistan, a liberal lens of individual rights, minority rights, every community having their rights, it kind of becomes redundant when faced with a multifaceted, complex society here. And so, yeah, that's just the final.
Another example that comes to mind is so they occupied Afghanistan and they justified endless occupation by saying we're socially engineering this society, we're making Afghanistan liberal and democratic because once, according to liberal theory, liberal democracies do not go to war with each other. And in order to ensure lasting stability around the world, we have to make Afghanistan a liberal democracy. And basically, that was the justification for endless occupation. However, in order to make Afghanistan a liberal democracy and promote individual rights, we have to incarcerate thousands of Afghans endlessly without any trial.
Afghan men.
Primarily Afghan men.
Overwhelmingly men.
Overwhelmingly men, yes. There was no trial. Everybody always talks about Guantanamo. Guantanamo was nothing. It was nothing. The prisons like Pulicharhi, Bagram, and small private and illegal prisons around the country, there were thousands and thousands of people being held as prisoners without trial. Their individual rights, their human rights were being violated because they were spreading liberalism. Now, here's the interesting thing. Aside from the fact that they were violating the rights of those people, they were bombing the entire villages, massacring so many people, all of that, they also created an armed force of police, military and local police and militia. And these guys, they were taking little boys as slaves. They were abusing those boys. And then when the American soldiers, the British soldiers, the Canadian soldiers, when they complained to their superiors and said, look, these guys, they are molesting those children. They said, oh, that's their local culture. That's culture. You have to respect their culture. We are not here to lecture them on how they should conduct themselves because that's not the goal of our war.
But we will give them the condoms.
Yes, like the insanity that was prevalent for 20 years in Afghanistan, and how it was justified. Like you have this very polished, clean, and very sophisticated, performative way of talking about how Afghanistan is going to be part of the international community. It has 20% of all members of parliament in Afghanistan have to be women. Like it was decided in the constitution that was created during the occupation, obviously.
Very progressive liberal.
Yes. Minimum 20% of the Afghan parliament have to be women. And it doesn't matter how these women become members of parliament and how they win elections in a society that never had elections like that. And no, it has to happen. And what you eventually get is a society where the values of the West, whether it's democracy, women's rights, minority rights, everything is tied to occupation and getting funding and support. So what does that eventually mean in a country like that? Everyone associates liberalism, democracy, women's rights, individual rights, human rights with corruption. Money. Nowhere in the world there is a country where society where people have so much disdain for liberalism as in Afghanistan. Not because they were indoctrinated and brainwashed by a overpowered state.
Even Soviet communist brainwashing could not produce this level of disdain toward liberalism.
No, and this is essentially what when we talk about social engineering, we have to also mention that they created educational institutions in Afghanistan specifically designed to promote liberalism, like in each embassy in Afghanistan.
The American University of Afghanistan.
In a country that is not industrialized, in a country where the most important necessity is vocational education, teaching people skills to produce, they created a liberal arts college, university, American university, where they were teaching gender studies and whatnot. And all those people,
by the way, for everyone that's going to be offended, I did the liberal arts degree as well, so we're not.
Me too. That's not the issue.
We're not anti-liberal arts crusaders. We're just pointing out, we're using our liberal arts degrees to highlight why they should not be front and center in a country like Afghanistan. I think this is the most practical sort of implementation. You know, this is the fruits of our education, right? It's to critically think.
So what's important is that they financed educational institutions in Afghanistan that were specifically designed to promote liberalism. They would have these trainings, workshops, and courses where they would pay people. They would literally pay people to attend a course on human rights, on women's rights at the American embassy in Kabul, and you would have groups of men and women who would sign up for that, and there was corruption involved in that as well. Getting signed up for a paid course so that you can go learn about human rights and women's rights, and people would only allow their own relatives and friends to attend those courses because they get paid, and then they can also attend and then get that course. And now, after the occupation, for the way to make sure that you get a visa and you can escape Afghanistan is to produce documents. Look, I attended that course on human rights. Now my life is in danger in Afghanistan. Like, it's a circus. They have created a circus, and a lot of people who get angry and frustrated when we talk about these matters, they don't realize that we're addressing a problem that was created by a very misguided, foolish government in United States that was driven by ideology, and it was perpetuating a problem and making it worse, which has brought us to this state right now in Afghanistan, where the government basically says, you know, if all these women are going to be educated to become activists in high heels and shout in the streets and cause havoc, maybe they shouldn't go to university at all. These are the consequences of actions. You know, this is the thing with being rational and realistic, is to always acknowledge that every action has its consequences. In every society, whatever you do, it has its consequences. It leaves a mark. It leaves an impression on people. People's attitudes and beliefs will change. If you think you're going to do social engineering, the chances are that the outcome is not going to be exactly what you had in mind, but the exact opposite. This is why the government that the United States created in Afghanistan collapsed in 11 days. This is why the entire armed forces ran away when they knew that the Americans are going to stop airstrikes and they're not going to support them with airstrikes, so they all gave up. This is why all those people who were educated and employed by the occupation were running like crazy towards Kabul airport to get on those airplanes and leave, because they didn't see a place for themselves in Afghanistan without occupation. They didn't saw themselves as functioning individuals in a society without the presence of military occupation. So all those values and beliefs that were exported to Afghanistan, all those things that they wanted to create, it was so shallow and so superficial that it took only 11 days for the whole system to collapse and another month to get all those people into the airport and out of Afghanistan. That's it. That's how it was finished and wrapped up.
And so on that note, the only thing that I'll end with is this, is that coming back to Mearsheimer, Mearsheimer says that liberalism is always defeated by two things, nationalism and realism, for the reason that both of them are closer to human nature. Nationalism is closer to human nature because human beings are social animals by definition, and realism is closer to human nature because human beings, above all, prioritize their survival, and realism is doing foreign policy prioritizing survival. And because for the simple reason that if you don't survive, you can't really carry out any other objectives. So at a time where the US is the only global hegemon in a unipolar system, it was at liberty to carry out attempted and failed liberal hegemony. But now, in the world within which we live, we see China as a rising challenge to the US. Russia, whilst it's not the Soviet Union, is still powerful enough to pose serious problems for US foreign policy interests. Because of these realities, the US has once again fallen back on realism, a result of which was the withdrawal from Afghanistan. And if you read Clausewitz's On War, I think I've actually got it here. Clausewitz's On War. Clausewitz defines war as trying, and he was actually pretty revolutionary in doing so. Clausewitz defines war as not just politics by other means, but he says that the objective of war is to make your enemy do what you want them to do, right? Here is Clausewitz On War. And I don't know if you guys can see the title. There we go. Karl von Clausewitz On War. So, and the most important thing is that a lot of people could say, well, the US didn't lose in Afghanistan because it's still the most powerful country in the world, and the Taliban are a bunch of guys in sandals and AK-47s. Be that as it may, the fundamental reality is that the Taliban's objective in this war was to get the US to withdraw. And what did the US do? Withdraw. By that metric, the Taliban won, and the US's impetus to withdraw was as a result of the new anarchic and challenging global power dynamics within which it found itself. So, everything being said, I think
two things that we before we wrap this up. Okay, so first and foremost, you mentioned that nationalism and realism are the two forces that basically trump liberalism. The Taliban identify themselves as a nationalist movement. They justify their war against the U.S. occupation as liberating the motherland. The way they justify it could be described as nationalist, and this is why it was so powerful. This is why their soldiers were willing to die and blow themselves up. But the soldiers that were hired by the liberal American hegemon that was occupying the country, they weren't. It's also explained by Mearsheimer's theory, why the soldiers of the previous government all dropped their guns and ran away. But the Taliban, with their bare feet or their sandals, they were willing to blow themselves up and die for
because they see themselves as part of a wider collective, a religious national collective. And human beings are, like Mearsheimer himself says, thus forfeiting any liberal manhaj that he could have been on. Human beings are social animals.
And this is basically, this is why this book is so important. If you carefully read this book, if you carefully read each chapter, each page, and you think about it, and then you think about what has happened in the last 2 decades in Afghanistan, you will understand that this book has a very strong explanatory power for explaining the American foreign policy towards Afghanistan and obviously the expansionist nature of liberalism, especially as we see in Eastern Europe with the ever-expanding NATO alliance towards the former Eastern Bloc countries, the fact that the United States wanted Ukraine to be part of NATO, the military alliance of the North Atlantic wanted Ukraine to be part of NATO. And in this book, Mearsheimer also explains how this basically antagonized Russia and
by the way, this book was written in 2018. 4
Yes.
years later, 4 years later, who invaded Ukraine?
Russia. And this book is so important because even then, in 2018, he already predicted what is going to happen. Now, there's an important point that we need to understand is that if you explain politics according to a particular theory, the theory is a tool. Just as I said in the beginning of the show, our professor, when I was in my first year at the university, he explained that theory is a tool. It's like you go to a shed, you pick up a tool, and then you work with it. And this is what a theory is. So if Mearsheimer posits a theory to explain international relations, you have to understand his book also as a theory, which explains phenomena that we observe in the world, you know. And that's why here at the Afghan Eye, what we what we're trying to do is try to explain matters in a way that makes sense. We're not here for, you know, fancy words and dogmatic chants and slogans. That's not what we do here. What we are trying to achieve here is that our audience, that they become capable of thinking for themselves and doing their own analysis. So that's why what I would say, guys, whatever we said about the application of the book of Mearsheimer to Afghanistan, if you disagree, please go read the book for yourself. Go study.
And finally, another thing, if you are going to read this book upon my strong suggestion and then come back and say, the first 2-3 chapters were very difficult and technical and theoretical and I couldn't get through it, and I dropped the book, then I would say that's fine, but then don't have an opinion. Not everyone is, you know that saying of Marcus Aurelius, Sangar, you always have the option of not having an opinion. And if you do not have the minerals and you are not built to read a couple of pages and exert your mind, then maybe just don't have an opinion. Watch something on Netflix instead. So
yes, like
not everything needs to be reduced for you, and you don't need to make sense. If you can't, grapple with it, then it's not for you, and go along and watch Netflix. So as rude as it sounds, it is what it is.
It is what it is. And this is also, I think, when we critique media, when we critique reports and narratives, like the Afghan Eye, the counter-narrative, our slogan is the counter-narrative. The reason why we do that is we want our audience to be like us, to be very critical and to think further than just, slogans and chants. It's about doing a deep dive into theory, doing a deep dive into history, doing a deep dive in literature, and understanding deeper roots of ideas and or current events. Only that's how you enable yourself to have an informed opinion and also understand others' perspective. Like I don't get aggressive, I don't get offended if somebody rejects all my beliefs. If somebody says Islam is not the truth and whatever you say, that's just hocus pocus, whatever, I don't get offended by that because I know, okay, this person, he probably has not studied what I have studied, or maybe if they have done their studying, they have...
He has a different tabula rasa.
Yes. But that's why, if you need to talk about enlightenment and progress and not being a sandal-wearing savage or whatnot stuff they call us, if you don't want to be any of that, then you have to read. Then you have to read, and you have to read heavy literature like this book.
And if not, like I said, you're free to go about your day, and you don't need to have an opinion. Because honestly, sometimes it's nice. So on that note, Sangar, I think we should wrap
Wrap
up.
this up.
Um,
Yes.
yeah. So once again, I have the book right here. Great Delusion, John J. Mearsheimer, Liberal Dreams and International Realities. In fact, the realism is even in the name, realities, as in there are dreams, dogmatic dreams, that are contradicted by realities, which is why there's a delusion. So, in any case, thank you very much to everyone that tuned into our last live stream. In addition to that, Eyes of Afghanistan
Yes, yes,
Kana.
yes, yes.
So
We have.
we have a new YouTube channel, Eyes of Afghanistan, Twitter channel as well. And what it is that since we've gotten back from Afghanistan, this is an announcement, and I want it to go back, and we're probably going to cut this bit out and put it all over socials as well. So hear me out. Since we've come back from Afghanistan, our content production and activity has been relatively limited because we've been working on a lot of different things, foremost amongst them this new page, Eyes of Afghanistan. This page, this Twitter handle, and this YouTube channel is run by a passionate and dedicated team who we have in Afghanistan that are there and focused on creating content from there. Please do follow them, like and share their content, and most importantly, subscribe, because what they will be doing is much like Sangar and I are young, passionate guys here. These are young, passionate guys in Afghanistan who've just completed quite a lot of training, and to whom we've managed to get quite a lot of equipment in order to be able to create content from Afghanistan, so you can see Afghanistan through the eyes of Afghans in Afghanistan, which is something that global discourse very rarely, if ever, affords us the opportunity of having, enjoying, and deriving any benefit from. So that is that. And inshallah, the next live stream will be in the next couple of weeks. And Gar, do you have anything to say?
Yes, guys, people who are still our patrons, thank you very much for your support throughout these last 3 years. Next month, the Afghan Eye is going to be 3 years old. We couldn't achieve any of that without the help and support of the people, our patrons on our Patreon page, people who have donated via PayPal, people who have donated by other means. Everything that you see, whether it's the new channel, the training and equipment and everything for our team in Afghanistan, this current channel, the podcast, the equipment, everything that we have achieved so far has been made possible with your help and support. And going forwards, expanding our operation, creating more content, we are hoping that you will continue supporting us. If you have never been a patron, if you are considering becoming a patron, please visit our Patreon page. If you want to do a one-off donation, you can do that via PayPal. If you want to get in touch with us, send us an email, info@afghani.org. You can follow us on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook. We're not very active on Facebook. You can visit all the links. They're all in the description. And until next episode, thank you all. Thank you very much for watching and listening. I wish you all the best.
We will have Sangar in a new hat for the next episode, inshallah.
Inshallah. Have a good day and take care of yourself and each other. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Wa alaikum salam.